Oh, good. Okay, good evening, everybody, and thank you to Abby for being here with us this evening. So, Dr. Abi Shapiro is curator at the Hepworth Wakefield with a specialist research interest in post-war sculpture and craft and their critical histories. Recent curatorial projects include Elizabeth Fritsch, Otherworldly Vessels, which is currently on at the Hepworth Wakefield that Abby will be talking to us about this evening. Kim Ling, Space, Rhythm and Light. Hannah Starkey in Real Life. The Art of the Potter, Sculpture and Ceramics from 1930 to Today. And Sheila Hicks, Off Grid. She has previously worked as a research curator, British Art 1945 to 1975 at Sheffield Museums, and has taught at the University of York, City and Guilds of London Art School, and McGill University. So I'm going to hand over to Abby now. Thanks for being here.
Amazing. Thanks, Laura. I'm assuming everyone can hear me okay. Do let me know if you can't. But just wanted to thank Laura for inviting me to speak. I'm a big fan of Common Thread, and this is really exciting to speak. And just thanks to everyone for joining tonight. So my talk is titled Sculpture and Craft at the Hepworth Wakefield. And when Laura said, "What do you want to title your talk? Can we talk about craft at the Hepworth Wakefield?" I sort of chafed initially and said, I think I'd like to have the word sculpture in there because that's a big part of what we do regarding Barbara Hepworth's legacy. But as I started preparing for this, I was intrigued at the thought of, well, how was I going to talk about craft? And why is craft still a term that sort of troubles things? And maybe it's just me, but it still feels a bit provocative at times. It still feels like it asks some questions of us. And I like that. And I wanted to take it as a kind of provocation today to think a bit about what does craft mean for us at the Hepworth Wakefield? What does it mean for our collection? What does it mean for our program? And how might some of the ideas about craft be actually more historically embedded within the last 100 years. As you'll come to hear me talk about, the collection at the gallery that we look after is over 100 years old. So some of the ideas around craft are already embedded in what we do and have sort of structured the way we think about craft. And then there's been individuals, artists, curators, directors who've disrupted those ideas. So I want to trace a little bit of those histories. So if you'll indulge me in going back a bit in time to think about some of this and also in relation to Barbara Hepworth as well. And then we'll end in a more contemporary moment with some of our current displays, both our collection displays, but also I'll be talking a bit about the Elizabeth Fritsch exhibition, which just opened in early March. So I'm going to talk for about, I think Laura said about 40, 45 minutes, and then there's some time for questions at the end. So yeah, really happy to take questions at the end and but I'll crack on for now. So, for those of you who may not have been to the Hepworth Wakefield, and I saw in the comments some of you would like to but haven't been yet, hopefully this will entice you up. The Hepworth Wakefield is located bang in the middle of the country. I always like to include a map because we often have people joining us from all over the world, and it's nice to just know. I won't take for granted that everybody knows where Wakefield is, but we are pretty much bang in the middle of the United Kingdom. And this is an image of our building. We're situated right on the edge of the River Calder, which is a main arterial waterway that goes through West Yorkshire. And we draw a lot of our heating and cooling systems from the waterway that's outside. There's a kind of extraordinary and magical kind of technological way that is beyond me that the building harnesses the energy from the river to use a lot of its power, which is fabulous. So the building itself is quite new. It was built in 2011, and it was designed by David Chipperfield to have it. It has a dual purpose. So it was built to house the Hepworth Wakefield collection, which was inherited from Wakefield City's art collection. So it's a civic collection that began in 1924 with a core of modern British art. And the building not only houses that in its stores, but it displays it regularly in its collection displays. And I'm going to talk a bit more about that shortly. The second purpose of the building was to house the Hepworth family gift. And this was a major gift of sculpture, preparatory material, tools, and all sorts of things to do with Barbara Hepworth and her life. And that's because Barbara Hepworth was born in Wakefield in 1903, not far at all from where the building is sited. And the family and the estate wanted to honour Hepworth's legacy and her time in Yorkshire, which was very, very formative for her in the way that she began to understand the body, the landscape, and abstraction, particularly as she developed her sort of signature style. So I'm going to talk about both of these things in tandem, thinking a bit about Barbara Hepworth and her relationship to sculpture and craft. And I'm going to talk a bit about the Wakefield Art Collection and its relationship to sculpture and craft. And then we'll end up in a more present moment. So if we just start with Barbara Hepworth, who is the namesake of our museum, it's this sort of early moment when Hepworth was living in Yorkshire until she was 18, and before she went to London to study at the Royal College with Henry Moore and many other artists, that she said that this was a really formative moment for her. So she said, all of my early memories are of forms and shapes and textures, moving through and over the Yorkshire landscape with my father in his car. The hills were sculptures, the roads defined the forms. And you can see a picture of Hepworth here staring out at Robin Hood's Bay, which is on the north coast of Yorkshire in North Yorkshire, and this is in 1925. So fairly early in her career, and I sort of love this image. Laura and I were just talking about this image a few minutes ago about this idea that she's really sort of absorbing and taking it all in. And she talks much more extensively in her writing and her letters in various places about how this relationship between her body and the Yorkshire landscape and the undulating hills, and you can see there she describes the hills as sculptures. She describes this relationship between the body and the land as formative to how she developed this technique of abstraction. It was about feelings, it was about using forms, colors, and motifs to begin to define something of this tension that she described it as a tension between the land and the body, and we'll see that a little bit more in some of the sculptures I'm going to show you. So here's Hepworth at work. She's working on the image on the left here. She's working on the piece that I've just included a small image of at the bottom, the wood carving hollow form with white interior. But I wanted to include this image of her working. It's her actively using her tools and carving. She's chiseling here, but she worked across a number of materials. Lots of her earlier works from the 30s and 40s were in wood, but she would come later to carve plaster before she would make casts to cast in bronze. So the process of sculpting for her was it held all kinds of different techniques and sounds, and she talked extensively about this kind of experience of the body in relation to the materials. But I think it's always brilliant to have an image of someone at work. And I wanted to show you a view of the current installation at the Hepworth Wakefield. So this is a permanent space in the museum that's dedicated to teaching and really education about Hepworth's process, how she worked, and particularly the tools and the techniques and the influences that she drew on in order to develop her practice in the different ways that she did from the 1930s up until when she died in 1975. So this is the same tool bench in the galleries now that you can see in that image on the left. And it has all of her tools. You can see there's no barriers around anything here. We very much want people to feel like they're immersed and they're engaged with, as much as possible, what it was like for Hepworth at the time, how she was working. And, Hepworth, she did have assistants later in her life, but it was really important to her that the work was done by her hand. Her assistants generally were helping her with the casting process later on. So this idea of kind of craft and craftsmanship and the artist's hand and technique was already really important and embedded within Hepworth's work. But while I was preparing for this talk, I mean, there's hundreds of sculptures that I could have talked about, but I thought it would be really interesting to just look at this particular work called Landscape Sculpture. And the reason for that is that it's one of her earlier works with string. And so there's a number of these stringed works, and as chance would happen, there's a wonderful exhibition right now at Piano Nobile in London showing Hepworth's stringed works. So if anyone's in London and can get to see that, I would highly encourage you to go because it's amazing works all in one place. But this is an example from our collection of a stringed work, and you can see that Hepworth is she's effectively using sewing techniques here. She's punctured the form of the sculpture here, and she's pulled these strings taut in order to reference this tension that I mentioned before between the body and the landscape. And there's a lot of these works. She was also quite interested in music. So I don't have time to go into that here, but there was also a kind of significance in that tension in a string about sound. But for her, the idea that this tension was particularly referencing the body and the landscape was significant. So this is one brilliant example of that you can see here. And then also with craft in mind, I wanted to look at this work in our collection, which is a print that she made directly onto silk. So some of you might have noticed the title of this work is the same title as the piece that I just showed you before, the bronze stringed work. And I think if we look at it, we can see some of those formal resonances, but it's a more of a deconstruction of the form. We can still see these kind of rounded, undulating shapes, which was probably Hepworth's reference to the landscape she was surrounded by, which at this time was down in St. Ives, where she moved in 1939 and would stay until she died. But we can still see the references to the strings if we look at the two pieces next to each other. And she worked quite closely with the Asher factory, the family who ran this business, who made these sorts of extraordinary scarves. I don't know if anybody knows about the history of it. It's really interesting. They worked with a lot of modern British artists. Henry Moore made one. Lots of really fabulous scarves that they made. So Hepworth would have worked very closely with the Asher family on doing this particular design and making sure that it was printed to her satisfaction. And she did make a number of prints throughout her life, particularly in the later years. And she was a very adept printmaker. So this for me was just an interesting example of going back and thinking about, again, Hepworth engaging with different techniques and drawing from kind of craft techniques that she was using in her work. Now, I want to go back just a little bit earlier in time, back to the 1930s, and to this particular exhibition from 1935 called, well, it didn't have a title actually. It was just an exhibition of the Seven and Five Society, who were a kind of revolving door group of artists. It began in the 1920s. There were lots and lots of different artists involved with it at various times. But in the middle of the 1930s, these were the artists that were associated with the group, and they put on an exhibition. And the reason that is so significant is, well, there's two reasons. One is that it was the very first fully abstract art exhibition in Britain. And the second reason is that it included pottery, and that's why I wanted to mention it today. And as you can see, so this is the exhibition catalogue cover on the front, but I've listed the artists' names there so that you can read them because it's a bit hard to read. But you can see Barbara Hepworth is listed there, Winifred Nicholson is listed there, who we know went on to use textiles in very interesting ways. There's an exhibition of her work in rugs that was on recently at MIMA in Middlesbrough. But the fact is that all of the works here, they're all painters or sculptors except for William State Murray, who was a potter. And he was also a painter. He did make paintings, but he made an awful lot of pottery, and he painted on the surface of his pots in this really expressive and interesting abstract way. And what I find fascinating about this exhibition is that it shows a particular moment in British art history where craft and pottery and functional objects are being brought together with paintings and sculptures. Now, that's not to say that the idea or whatever we might define craft as in a more functional language necessarily applied in these terms, but it's the fact that all of these artists were very interested in the idea of exhibiting with a potter and including pottery, which had been traditionally thought of as a craft form within this abstract art exhibition. And I just wanted to include this quote by William State Murray because I think it sums up what he was thinking about at the time. He says, "Pottery is by nature the most abstract of the plastic arts. It does not explain, it only indicates its usefulness in its emptiness. In the mind of the potter, the positive and the negative of the pot form are one." So he's thinking about use value. He's thinking about an emptiness and what does this mean and how is it defined? But we know from letters from many of the artists here that they were completely accepting of having ceramics in these exhibitions and found that to be completely valid. And I suppose something I find frustrating sometimes is that craft and decorative arts are sort of painted as always having been split out from the so-called fine arts. And actually, exhibitions like this show us that that's not the case. So I wanted to kind of take this as a starting point to think how I wanted to talk about modern British art, and particularly the Wakefield Art Collection, because I think there were individuals, there were artists, there were directors, and there were curators who were thinking more along the lines of the way these artists were and thinking about craft as being part of not, I don't want to split it out and say it was craft or it was fine art, but they were much more encompassing of looser definitions of these terms and incorporating it. It was about materials and it was about abstraction rather than this sort of, you know, parsing of what these terminologies meant at the time. So if we, with that in mind, I wanted to just think about the Wakefield art collection alongside what I've just spoken about. And as it's always nice to have illustrations, and I'm a complete archive geek, I wanted to show you some images of the buildings where the Wakefield art collection was housed before it moved into the Hepworth Wakefield. You can see these are much more traditional museum buildings. So Homefield House on the left there, where the gallery first showed the collection in its very, very early stages in 1924. This building is now a pub. So if you ever want to come and visit us and stay overnight and you really want to deep dive into the Wakefield art history, you can stay there. And then the gallery collection moved to Wentworth House, which was right in the middle of town, actually not far at all from where Hepworth lived, in 1934, and it stayed there until 2008. And then there was a sort of period where the new building was being built, and then the collection moved across. Now, what I've listed under here, you can see that I've noted down accession numbers, and this was something that I've been quite interested in our collection for a while now, which is just to explain, I'm sure most of you know, but an accession number is a unique number that's given to an object when it enters a museum so that you can be clear that it's not being confused with anything else. And in our collection, and it's a little bit different in all collections, but in our collection, we give these designations to each sort of genre or subcategory of art that comes in, and they get these letter number formats assigned to them. So the very first painting to come into collection would have been A1.1, and then every painting thereafter was sort of built. So the most recent painting we have in the collection is something like 2000 and something other, because there's a lot of paintings. But as you can see, they've split them out into painting, sculpture, prints, pottery, and craft. And I find this really interesting because we still have to adhere to this in the museum today. If we have an acquisition, we have to decide, is it painting, sculpture, print, pottery, or craft? Now, in the interest of transparency, we don't really use the craft designation at all anymore. The B3 is barely used ever because I think there might be 3 works in the collection that have that designation. There's lots of reasons for that in the early years why that was true. There were what would be considered more craft items and materials early on, but at some point that seemed to drop away and everything became either sculpture or pottery. And today we still have discussions when we acquire something. Should we call it sculpture or should we call it pottery? Because it might be an artist who works with clay who doesn't want their work to be described as pottery. They describe it as sculpture, in which case, which designation does it get? So it's not that we need to necessarily get hung up on these terms, and ultimately, it doesn't really matter potentially what the designation and accession number is given. But the reason that I mention it is because it's giving us this kind of structure that we have to work within that's still asking us to separate out medium or materials or 3D versus 2D or pottery versus craft versus sculpture. And so we're still kind of grappling with some of these things, and it gives us a kind of framework from the really early days. This would have happened in the 1930s about how these sort of terminologies were being used. So the last object, whoops, gone ahead. The last image that I've included here is a little newspaper clipping from the 1950s, which is spotlighting the role of Helen Capp, who was our first and only, one and only female director of the Wakefield Art Gallery in its entire history. And the reason that I just want to touch on her work is because she was largely responsible for bringing in what we might think of as modern, mid-century modern craft into the collection. In the 1950s, she began acquiring works by Lucy Ree, by Hans Koper, by a number of artists that I think we have to see as working at this intersection of sculpture and craft and pottery, studio pottery particularly, and how she began to really trouble some of the more, historically or traditional definitions of these kinds of terms. And she was a really feisty woman. She's really fabulous. I've done a lot of research on her. She's quite wonderful. And one of the things that she enjoyed doing was going to the local press and being rather provocative in her various statements of what she thought art should be doing, and particularly what she thought art in regional museums should be doing. And she was very much, as you can see from the title of this, it says provinces should encourage artists more role of the factory patron. So she believed that museum directors and curators should be working with local artists. They should be showing the work of local people, local, not just artists, but craftspeople, as I will show shortly. And this was very much within the tradition of the Wakefield Art Gallery as it was set up, was to acquire the work of living artists. And this was really unusual at the time. In the 1930s, most regional galleries were drawing together Victorian paintings that they thought, the kind of uneducated masses would be transformed by some sort of Victorian moralist paintings and have a better understanding of, how we should behave through religious images or, some kind of moralizing narrative paintings or sculptures. And in fact, Wakefield set itself quite apart and said, actually, we want to just acquire the work of living artists and we want to build a collection around that. And that's very much what we've honored still today and what we do when we build our collection. But Helen Capp was at the forefront of really doing this in the 1950s and the early 1960s. And one of the major exhibitions that she is very, very famous for, and I think to this day might exceed all of our visitor figures, even now, is this exhibition that she put on in 1959 called Living Today. And I've included a couple of the kind of headline names of some of the artists at the top there. But I just want to tell you a bit more about it because I think it was a really extraordinary vision that she had at the time. So for this exhibition, Helen Capp invited 8 architects to refurnish and redecorate the galleries of the former townhouse. So this is the building on the right here, Wentworth House, which used to be a home and then was repurposed into a gallery. So she invited electricians, she invited plumbers, she invited the local gas companies to come in and turn all of the rooms in the building back into functional domestic spaces, including a bathroom, including a kitchen. And I've included here one image from the living room. And just for the brevity of time, I haven't included more, but I think Yeah, there's a lot more online, I think, that you can find. But anyway, so she completely transformed these into domestic spaces. So she invited, these are her words, painters, sculptors, potters, decorators, and weavers to work with architects and designers to make specific rooms that could be utilized by visitors. So they could come in and they could sit down, as this lady in the image on the left is doing. And it was designed to blur the distinction between the disciplines and create a holistic living environment. And the exhibition had 20,000 visitors in 2 months, which is extraordinary. So she described the aim of the exhibition first to demonstrate that art is not exclusive. It's not only to do with pictures or sculptures, but that it should penetrate into every aspect of domestic life, from a teaspoon to a town plan. And second, she said, to help raise the standard of design. Although tastes differ, and for this we hope to make plenty of allowance, good design is always based on two qualities, efficiency and good looks, which I thought was a kind of great description. So, what I find interesting about this is that she's sort of interrogating a particularly interesting post-war moment and thinking about these definitions of art and craft and design with a quite anti-elitist, but also functionalist approach. So one that saw art in all its forms as both practical tools, but one with which people could improve their daily lives. So with good design would come a good life, is effectively a very kind of modernist take on things. And she concluded, and this is the quote I've included below, that the exhibition was there to demonstrate that architecture, painting, sculpture, and crafts were deeply interlocked, that to understand and enjoy art is not only to enrich the spirit, but also to cultivate and sharpen observation and discrimination to know more precisely what we want. So, with this in mind, the and this kind of attitude in mind, in 2018, the Hepworth Wakefield, in its new form, in its new building, decided to basically revitalize this exhibition concept. In this exhibition that was called Giles Round, the director. So the exhibition it opened in 2018, and it marked 300 years since the birth of Thomas Chippendale, who was born in Otley, outside of Leeds, in 1718, who many of you will know was one of the most influential designers and entrepreneurs that Britain ever produced. He's often cited as the first interior designer and an early pioneer of brand creation, and he famously devised whole room schemes for aristocratic houses, including Nostell in Wakefield, which you can also go visit. So if you want to come and have a bonanza in Wakefield and see all the sites, Nostell is also a fabulous place to visit. But Chippendale famously used Nostell for these redesigning of rooms, and he employed all kinds of different craftspeople to create all of the different furniture, the fixtures, the fittings, everything that went inside it. So the Hepworth Wakefield invited the artist Giles round. For this anniversary to basically reanimate the idea of living today that Helen Kapp had done in 1959 and restage all the fabulous contemporary makers today in the gallery. So this is how it came to look. And I'll just show you another slide here of another image of that gallery. So everything in Helen Kapp's exhibition was for sale. As I said, it included Lucy Rees, it included paintings by Terry Frost. It was a kind of fabulous selling exhibition. And when this exhibition by Giles Round opened, it was also selling the work, most of the things that were in here, except the paintings, which came from the collection, which were not for sale. Okay, so moving along swiftly, I wanted to just touch briefly on this exhibition, which is a quite recent exhibition that we staged called Art of the Potter, Ceramics and Sculpture from the 1930s to Today. So this very much drew upon what I mentioned earlier about William State Murray, Barbara Hepworth, and Ben Nicholson in the 7 and 5 Society, and this idea that sculpture and craft and pottery were actually much more comfortable bedfellows than perhaps some histories histories of modern British art have led us to believe. And the exhibition, particularly, so this exhibition that we staged at the museum, particularly looked at ways that sculpture and ceramics has had a very early relationship from the 1930s. So we showed Hepworth's alongside State Murray's, we showed Nicholson's alongside fabric designs from the time. It was really brilliant to be able to have something really interdisciplinary, but it was very transhistorical. So it also looked at those histories of sculpture that had changed in relation to pottery, and also histories of especially studio pottery that had changed in relation to sculpture. So in this image, we can see on the very right, we can see a sculpture by William Turnbull, who was working with a number of, he educated a lot of artists. He was teaching at the same time as Edoardo Palozzi at the Royal College. He was teaching people like Elizabeth Fritsch at the same time as they were also learning to throw pots. So they were being taught by sculptors, and those sculptors had quite an influence on particularly what we now think of as that kind of postmodern turn in British studio pottery towards that kind of expressive expansion of the vessel. So on the left here is the work of Ewan Henderson, and that's actually also a painting by Ewan Henderson. He made a number of watercolors. So again, showing these kind of interplays between media. There's also the work of Jennifer Lee, a little bit further in the distance there, and also a number of drawings by her behind two of her pots. And then on the back corner is the work of Gabriel Koch, and also an early work by Magdalena Dundoe. So the exhibition looked quite expansively at this relationship. And again, trying to kind of unpick, why have we necessarily separated out these terms? Is ceramics not effectively sculpture, but just using clay? How have these terms been changed and troubled over the course of the century? So other exhibitions that Hepworth Wakefield has staged that have interrogated these kinds of histories. A good example of this would be Sheila Hicks, which we staged in 2022. This exhibition, as you know, Sheila Hicks was an American artist, but she was living and working in Paris and in Europe and a number of other places in the world for the rest of her life. She didn't ever go back to live in America after she left when she was a student. And this was taking sculpture and craft and thinking about it on a more international scale, and particularly thinking about Sheila's influence from the Bauhaus. She was trained by Joseph Albers, and had a very sort of formalist Bauhaus training, and this idea that you should be able to work across different materials with a kind of modernist point of view. So color and form were the more important things, and you could turn your hand to different uses of materials. And what was really interesting about this exhibition is Sheila had very kind of specific ideas about terminology. She didn't want her work to be talked about as craft. She didn't want to talk about it as textile. She wanted it to be talked about in sculptural terms. And so there was the room that you're looking at in this image was the sort of looking back on the more historical section of her career. So from the 1950s, when she was making her early weavings, through the 1960s and 1970s. And you can see some of the rugs on the back wall and the wall hangings that she had on the back, where she's using linen threads and sort of stacked pieces of wool to make sort of sculptural forms. And these, for her, were very much within the language of sculpture. And wherever possible, we tried to allow space around the work so that people could move around them. So this is just some details of some of those pieces. And the work on the right, the prayer rug, the pink prayer rug, it's not a great image, but you could move all the way around that piece. And it was really important for her that you could see through those holes that she'd left in the spaces of the weaving. So that was again an interesting exhibition in terms of, how do we start to talk about these histories of sculpture, of craft? How do they intertwine? How do they diverge? And what are the kind of politics? And it's also very interesting working with Sheila, who was very, very resistant to gender being any kind of part of the discussion of these histories. We wanted to ask her all the questions. What was it like being a woman working at this time? And she just wasn't interested at all in that. And that was very interesting for me. But the last image that I want to show here was a commission. So it was a piece that she made, a site site-specific piece that she made for the gallery. And you can see it's good to have always good to have a human in these images because it gives you a sense of the scale. It was an absolutely massive work. If anyone who's present today came to see it, it really did feel like it was just tumbling out of the wall and it was kind of coming at you. And there were sort of numerous children who threw themselves into it, and I couldn't blame them after I kind of recovered from my initial shock as a curator about the work being jumped on. But it was so inviting as a kind of piece of material. And I think that speaks a lot to what Sheila was working on, and what she was doing in her practice was this kind of bodily engagement with materials. And if we think back to Barbara Hepworth and how she worked, that's sort of something implicit, I suppose, in the way that we program our exhibitions. Is things are very materially driven in our practice, and we work with artists who are driven by materials and how materials kind of inform what they do. But this relationship between the body and material is very much at the heart of what we're often thinking about. So moving on to contemporary displays, so things that are visible in the gallery right now. This is a current display that we have called a living collection. So this is the first room that you walk into when you come into the museum. And it's always called a living collection. The title never changes, but the works within it change all of the time. And this is because we want to demonstrate all of the new acquisitions that we're acquiring all of the time. And it's brilliant because we have the flexibility to do that. We can replace things on and off. But it also gives a real sense of how we enjoy displaying modern British artwork alongside very contemporary makers. And this is a small display of new acquisitions, largely of artists working with clay here. And I couldn't quite fit in Jill Crowley's hand in the image, so I've just included a little image of it on the side. But it's also part of that display. So these are all works in clay, except for the Bernard Leach work I'll show you in just a second. But I've included this long sculpture by Sarah Radstone. Val Barry's pieces those are three pieces by Val Barry. Halima Castle's amazing cast piece there. Ursula Morley Price is the blue winged figure. In fact, if I go to the next image, you can see these better. So that's Ursula Morley Price on the left in the blue, Betty Blandino's white pot, Bernard Leach's drawing of a pot that he made for Barbara Hepworth because they knew each other in St. Ives, and then a very recent acquisition from Ashraf Hanna. So again, sort of showing a kind of different way that these kind of what I see as very, very, very sculptural forms in clay are being used, but also alongside a kind of more historical making historical dialogues. Also in this room is this piece by Noor Jauda, who is born in 1977, so really young and really kind of making an impact in her career at the moment. Really extraordinary artist. This is a piece called The Dust That Never Settles that was made in 2024, and we acquired it. It was on display at Frieze last autumn, and it was acquired through the Contemporary Art Society and the Frieze collections fund, and we're absolutely delighted to have it at the gallery. So that's the work on the left, and then I just included a detail on the right there, so that you can see a bit more. So Jauda describes this work as a multi-layered textile landscape that takes inspiration from shapes, colors, and motifs that the artist experienced growing up in Libya and Cairo, in particular Islamic architecture and local plant life, that she's drawn from to create layers of the past and the present memories. So she uses a slow and sometimes laborious physical process of making her work that involves ripping, tearing, and cutting pieces of cloth that have been hand dyed with an array of vegetal dyes, which she then irons and rips up and then arranges and eventually stitches each layer together to create an abstract tapestry. And this work is unbelievably heavy. I couldn't believe how heavy this piece was when we brought it in. So it just sort of goes to show the kind of layers of work that are there. So these are all new acquisitions that have come in recently. We have a collecting policy in place for us, as I said, that is kind of about acquiring work by living artists and artists that are very materially driven, speaking to the climate and the culture in which they're working. But particularly artists who we see as doing something exciting, something new, innovating, and that also adds something into our collection. So this work, particularly with the reference to the natural world and the landscape and the artist's relationship to her own landscape, again speaks to these kinds of legacies that Barbara Hepworth was working with about her tension between the landscape and the body. Okay, so I've got about 7 or 8 minutes to finish, and I just wanted to introduce you to our Elizabeth Fritsch exhibition, which opened at the beginning of March, called Otherworldly Vessels, and it's on for a really long time, which is brilliant. So if you are thinking about making a trip, you've got lots of time to see it. It will be on until February 2026. So I'm going to give you just a whistle-stop tour through this exhibition, but please, you're all very, very welcome to come to the galleries and see it for yourself. And one thing I would say is, no matter the photographs you take of these works, they do not do justice to the three-dimensionality and the optical illusions that you must experience in person. So do think about coming for a visit. So the exhibition opens with this quote, which I think is interesting in relation to William State Murray's. Fritsch says, "The pot is not functional, although oh dear, I've cut off a word there. It says it's a real container, being fully vitrified and watertight. The pot's function is poetic, metaphoric, and fictional." So this is a really good opener to help understand Elizabeth Fritsch and her work. So the exhibition is a survey of Fritsch's career. It's the first retrospective exhibition in 15 years. The last one was in Cardiff in 2010, and it features a large selection of the artist collection. So it's composed almost entirely of works that Elizabeth held back into her own collection that she felt was the best examples of the things that she made. So they've not been shown in public before. It's an extraordinary opportunity to come and see what she felt was basically the best of the best that she had made and that she refused to give away and sell into the art market. She wanted to keep for people to experience at the right time, and she felt that this was the time to do it. The works have all been arranged in these sort of careful compositions, which have been designed by Elizabeth herself. So she compares them to movements in classical music, and I quote, "in which the arrangements add up to more than the sum of its parts. I want to enable people to enjoy the work as a form of dance and play in space." So all of these works have been very, very, very carefully pre-arranged by Elizabeth about 2 years ago. She set them all out in her studio. She measured the gaps and the distances between them because for her, it's not just about the individual piece or a selection of a couple of pieces that she's made in series. It's about the way that they all are experienced together. It's the way that the body interacts with those works, the gaps between them, the negative spaces which bring them alive. So Elizabeth was born in 1940, and she's really considered a pioneer abstract geometric pattern painter. And it's really interesting because she describes herself as a painter who makes pots. And this is how she wanted us to use the language in the exhibition. She said, "I'm not a potter, I'm not a ceramicist, I'm not, I don't make pots. I make vessels and I make paintings on vessels." And she describes them as being in 2.5 dimensions. And I find this really interesting. So they're somewhere between 2D and 3D. So she really positions herself as a painter and a sculptor rather than a potter. So she, just to give you again a whistle stop sort of tour of her background, she was actually trained in classical music. She did a degree in piano and harp, and then she taught herself to make pots in the mid 1960s. And then she went to the Royal College of Art in London to study between 1968 and 1971. She trained under Hans Koper and Lucy Ree, but Koper was predominantly her mentor. And she became associated with a group of Royal College graduates, including Alison Britton, Glenys Barton, Jill Crowley, Carol McNichol, and Jacqueline Poncelet. And it was their brightly coloured and expressive forms that began to challenge functional British studio pottery traditions and inspired a shift towards clay, more sculptural possibilities. And we haven't released details of this yet, but we are going to be having an event in June, at the end of June, which is hopefully bringing together most of those potters and having an event to celebrate what that group of amazing artists were doing at the end of the 1970s and the impact that it had on studio pottery thereafter. So tune in for more details of that. So by 1964, Fritsch had developed a highly original series of forms and painterly techniques that she would then revisit throughout her career. So she was greatly influenced. So it was a very formative moment in 1974 for her. I'm going to show you some images of the works that she made at that time and an important exhibition that she had in 1974. But just to finish, she was greatly influenced by Renaissance fresco paintings, as well as the optical and perspectival illusions in Cubism and Surrealism. She also drew inspiration from jazz, from Roman and Greek myths and rituals, from urban architecture, from mathematics, and from quantum physics. And the unique combination of these influences invites us to think about the new perspective she took, which the artist calls otherworldly states of existence. So just to show you some images from the exhibition itself. So these are some fabulous images that we blew up on big pieces of vinyl in the exhibition, particularly for children to understand how she made her works, which was through coiling. And you can see, I just love these images. They were taken in 1974 by Philip Sayer for Crafts magazine, but they just illustrate perfectly the process of how she makes her pots. These are a number of early works that we borrowed from the Crafts Council from her first exhibition at Waterloo Place in 1974. You can see the poster there for that exhibition. And these are the forms that really kind of solidified for her. They kind of crystallized, and then she would continue to use those forms thereafter. So you see the optical cup, which looks three-dimensional from this side, but is actually very flat. You see the moon pocket, which is the one right in the center with the red interior. You see that motif recurring over and over again, and the vase forms and the bottle forms. So it's interesting to me that as early as 1974, she said, "These are my forms. These are what, you know, this kind of painterly style," and she really stuck with that. And then moving on, so this is another installation view. So you can see all of these different groupings that she made. And I should say they're all achronological. Nothing is grouped in order of how they were made. She just wanted to have these dialogues between the pieces as she was going along. So lots of them come from very different time periods. There's a section within the display that looks at the works that were inspired by jazz. So these are all called jazz pots. They're from a series that she made. Most of these, not all of them, but most of them were made in the 70s. And they were part of this amazing touring exhibition that started in Leeds called Pots About Music. And I've included the exhibition catalogue there. And the work on the cover is called Crescendo Pot. And you can see it in the exhibition there. We borrowed it from Leeds. And it's a really amazing work. And all of these pots draw on her influences from jazz and this idea about improvisation, and the kind of spontaneity that comes from particularly piano jazz. And we also included a Ben Nicholson work alongside that display, and because she was very influenced by Nicholson's colors and his abstract compositions. So just moving through a couple of images from the rest of the displays. This is another example of works, very trans-historical works from her. There's works from the 70s here that go right up to 2008. So again, for her, it was about the interactions that the forms and the pots, or the vessels, I should say, were having with each other. And again, the way we displayed them was on these very, very deep plinths so that you could move around them and you can see them from different sides. And then just to conclude, to end the talk, is the final series of works in the exhibition, which were made again over a number of different decades, but they show a slight shift in her practice at a point where she was beginning to draw on more architectural forms. And she was really interested in surrealist stories that talked about architecture, sort of surrealist architecture, by authors like Borges, and sort of drawing on some of the ideas from these texts, and also ideas in mathematics about how to kind of go about making these works. So I think I'll finish there, um, if that's okay, and I'll open up to questions.
Great. Let me just come in here. Just remove the spotlight so everyone should be on a tile. Um, Thank you, Abby. That was amazing. That was really, really amazing. There was so much. This, I have so many questions. But we'd love to hear from all of you. If you have any questions, um, oh yeah, is this one in the chat? Oh no, it's just a compliment. Thank you, Nicola. Um, I'll just get things started perhaps, and it's a very boring practical question, Abby, that I hope isn't too dull. But one of the phrases you used for the Elizabeth Fritsch pots earlier was kind of an optical illusion. And I was just looking at the rooms and how they're displayed on the tables. And while some of them, while there's one table that you can walk around, the rest are obviously against a wall. And I love like the idea that you had to kind of choose which, like, how did you choose which angle to place the pots at, and what was involved in that decision making?
So actually, I had very little curatorial input other than where the tables went in the room, because Liz had pre-designed all of this
Oh wow.
years ago, and like literally the depths of the distance between the works and how far they would be back, was all already,
Wow.
pre-agreed effectively. It was challenging. It would have been nice to have everything in the middle of the room so you could completely move around it, but it just wasn't possible, partly because the artist wanted everything to be on open display. So nothing is covered in perspex, everything is open on tables, which initially was slightly alarming because these are sort of very high value and delicate ceramics, but that's what she wanted, and she really was sort of strong in that feeling. So some of the works had to go against the walls, but again, the tables are a meter deep, so the pots sit actually quite far forward. So when you come around the side of the tables, you can almost see to the backs. But yeah, it's a shame that we couldn't make it all fully accessible from all sides.
Well,
But
I love that idea of the artist as curator, though, the idea that their works don't exist kind of individually or, autonomously. They kind of exist in this like larger vision of them as a collective body of work. And the fact that she was kind of already thinking about these kind of exhibitions, many years ago is quite incredible to think of. And I don't know if many, especially women artists, would have had that kind of foresight to preserve their work for situations such as this. So it isn't all kind of dispersed across the country. It's all in her possession and she can display it how she would like. And yeah, it's very forward thinking.
yeah, definitely, it's nothing like I've come across before. In fact, you often think about museum collections as having the best examples of works, and she has placed amazing works into museums, but yeah, as you say, it's very interesting that she chose to hold back what she thought was the best examples of her work, um,
Yeah.
until when she felt ready. And I love that kind of autonomy or control that she wanted to have over it.
Yeah, absolutely. And if anyone has any questions, you can turn on your mic and speak, uh, you know, say them out loud, or you can put them in the chat, whichever suits you. Um, Maybe I'll just hop back to Sheila Hicks for a second. And am I right in remembering that you were saying that she didn't want kind of gender to have anything to do with her exhibition? And I think that's something that I've noticed with kind of artists of an older generation who are kind of refusing this term of a woman artist, but women artists today perhaps are kind of using it as a bit more of something to establish them in a canon of artists that are currently, the value of women artists at the moment is extremely high and it's kind of on the up, isn't it, the value of their work. And I just wonder whether kind of you noticed that as well, collecting artists like Noor Juda and also working with older artists, kind of how you see that relationship to identity, gender identity.
Yeah, definitely. And I think Hepworth is a brilliant example to sort of kick that discussion off with because she was repeatedly, it was sort of leveled at her all of the time. Aren't you good for being a woman? And she really, really chafed against that. And there's lots and lots of quotes where she says, it doesn't matter that I'm a woman, it's insignificant, it's completely irrelevant. And why do people sort of bring this to me? I'm just an artist. And it feels like in the 30s and 40s she was pretty, and even the 50s she was using the kind of language of men, which was to say it doesn't matter who makes the work, it's just whether or not it's good quality.
Mm,
And of course
mm,
we know now there was discrimination at play in
mm,
all sorts of reasons, but she was sort of, I think, more like mimicking the language that she was seeing around her. But actually, in her private notes and in her diaries and in her letters, many of which have been made more public now, she talks about the struggle that she went through as a mother of triplets. And actually, as a single mother, a lot of the time, Ben Nicholson was away from home, some of the time having an affair with Winifred Nicholson. So she was struggling, and she knew that was partly to do with her circumstance and her gender, and but she had to work doubly hard for that never to be known or seen, and she never ever mentioned it. So initially I really thought, oh God, Hepworth was like the anti-feminist when I started working there, because she just refused to acknowledge, you know shouldn't we be celebrating that women were overcoming and achieving things despite all of these barriers that they face? But it's really interesting when you see she was aware of all of those issues, but she just didn't want to talk about them in public. And I see that as the same as Sheila Hicks, and I see that maybe even the same as Liz in Elizabeth Fritsch, where there's this sort of, they were raised at a moment where if you exceptionalized yourself as a woman, you were sort of drawing on something that just wasn't relevant. And now I think a younger generation completely understand that, women face barriers, they face disadvantages, and also their gendered experiences inform the
mm,
kind of work that they make, and the traditions that they perhaps draw upon.
mm,
Whereas sculpture and weaving and even pottery, I think for those three artists, they rejected that there was any kind of gendered or feminization of those skills.
mm. Yeah. Um, just a couple minutes left if anyone wants to ask a question. Oh, here we go. Thanks, Karina. Karina's asked, do you find that craft has been growing more within gallery spaces?
I do, and I feel very encouraged by, that galleries are sort of not as concerned with these disciplinary definitions anymore. I mean, I started the talk by saying craft is still a provocative term to me. And even though, nobody at the Hepworth Wakefield would blink if we said we wanted to do a show with textiles, or, they would never say, oh, but we can't do that, it's craft. That discussion doesn't
Mm,
happen. But it's still a term that I think to the general public and to audiences, it still kind of poses a challenge, especially to older audiences. Is this fine art? What traditions is it coming from? And personally, one of the things that I think is important in the work museums do is that they understand the legacies that come behind these activities. So we can, anybody can display craft, anybody can display anything in a museum, but one of the things that museums can do, and I think should do, is understand the traditions and the histories behind them. And I think it's really important that we're not kind of showing a singular view of, craft was this or craft was that. And I think, I was trying to sort of tease that out within the Wakefield art collection as a case study about how craft, sculpture, pottery, all of these terminologies in some ways are limiting, but in other ways we're
mm,
being ignored and we're being liberated.
mhm,
So yes, I do see that happening more now. And I think it's great, but I still think there is a kind of hierarchy a little bit still in the market and in galleries and museums taking risks to be able to show things.
Mhm. Amazing. Okay, that kind of brings us to time for the evening. I hope you all enjoyed this evening. I think it's been absolutely fantastic, and I don't know what I expected from this evening, but it was so much more than I was envisioning, and in the best way possible. So many interesting questions kind of came up, and you teased out so many interesting kind of challenges in curating and collecting textiles and craft, and also how we talk about their histories. Um, just to respond to that question, yeah, the recorded version will be available. I'll send it round. If not this evening, then tomorrow. Just whilst I have your attention, because it may be of interest to you, we're just about to announce another talk in June, that's about the textiles of Ireland, with the editor of a new book that's just come out about Irish textile history. So if you are on our social media or our newsletter, you should hear about that shortly. Okay, I'll end the recording now.